Emma Turner adjusted the strap of her purse and checked the time on her phone again. The hotel lobby was warm with soft lights, the kind that made everyone look a little calmer than they really were. But inside, Emma was restless. Her husband, Daniel, had been upstairs for over an hour, locked in yet another business meeting. She had agreed to come along only because Daniel had promised they'd have dinner afterward, something they hadn't done in weeks. Yet here she was, waiting in the plush lobby, feeling more like a shadow than a partner. Emma sighed, glancing at the tall windows where rain tapped gently against the glass. People moved in and out of the revolving doors, business travelers with rolling luggage, families checking in for a weekend stay, and servers carrying trays toward the conference rooms. She felt out of place in her simple navy dress. Caught between her husband's world of long hours and her own quiet life that often felt invisible, she shifted in her seat, staring at the lobby's grand chandelier when a voice interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Turner. Emma turned and found herself face to face with Richard Hale, the man her husband often mentioned at home. She had imagined him differently, cold, maybe even intimidating. Instead, Richard stood there with a quiet confidence, his gray suit tailored perfectly, his tie crisp, and his dark eyes watching her with more kindness than she expected. "You must be Daniel's wife," he said smoothly. "I thought I recognized you from the photo he keeps on his desk." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, that's me, Emma." Richard smiled, and it wasn't the stiff business smile she imagined he would give to clients or staff. It was warmer, almost personal. "It's good to finally meet you. Daniel talks about you often." The words surprised her. Daniel rarely shared much at home about work, and she had always assumed he kept his family life separate from the office. If Richard knew about her, it meant Daniel had spoken about her more than she realized. That thought softened her shoulders a little. Still, she wasn't sure how to respond. Richard was her husband's boss. She had no script for this kind of encounter before she could gather her thoughts. Richard glanced toward the restaurant doors just off the lobby. The sound of clinking silverware and soft piano music drifted from inside. Then he looked back at her. "If you don't mind my saying, you look like you've been waiting a while. Meetings with Daniel tend to run longer than expected." Emma gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "That's true. He loses track of time when it comes to work." Richard tilted his head, studying her for a moment. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he said, "Why don't you join me for lunch? The restaurant here is excellent, and it's far better than waiting alone." Emma's breath caught. Lunch. With her husband's boss. The idea seemed strange, maybe even inappropriate. She wasn't sure if Daniel would approve. But the way Richard asked didn't feel improper. There was no arrogance in his voice, no sense of command, just a quiet invitation. Almost considerate, her first instinct was to refuse politely. Yet something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity. For years, she had only heard Richard's name mentioned in passing, usually paired with Daniel's long hours, strict deadlines, or ambitious projects. She had built an image of him as a demanding, hard-to-please executive. And now, here he was, standing before her with steady eyes, offering kindness instead of pressure. Emma hesitated, her fingers curling around the strap of her purse. "I wouldn't want to intrude," she said softly. "You wouldn't be," Richard replied without missing a beat. "It's not business. Just lunch. Besides, I'd like to know the woman who supports Daniel through all these late nights. Believe me, I understand the sacrifice it takes." His words carried weight. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't only talking about business. Emma felt a flicker of recognition, like maybe he understood the loneliness she often pushed aside. Her heart thudded faster, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe it was the unexpected gentleness in his voice. Either way, she found herself nodding before she had fully thought it through. "All right. Lunch sounds fine." Richard's smile deepened, not wide or showy, but genuine. He gestured toward the restaurant entrance. "After you." As she walked beside him, Emma felt the weight of the moment pressing down. It was only lunch, she reminded herself. Nothing more. but she couldn't shake the sense that she had just stepped into something unusual, something that might shift the way she saw both her husband's world and her own place in it. The restaurant was elegant, filled with small, round tables draped in white linen. A pianist played softly near the bar, filling the air with a gentle melody. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying plates that smelled faintly of roasted herbs and butter. The room was busy, but Richard requested a table near the windows, away from the center of the crowd, as the host guided them to their seats. Emma couldn't ignore the odd flutter in her chest. Sitting across from Richard felt like stepping into a conversation she had been waiting for without realizing it. When they settled, menus placed before them, Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but watchful. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he began, "but it's rare I get to meet the families behind my team. Daniel is one of my most committed employees, and I've always wondered about the person who gives him the strength to do what he does." Emma felt her cheeks warm. Compliments about Daniel weren't unusual, but Richard's way of linking Daniel's work to her role at home struck her differently. It was as though he had noticed something even Daniel sometimes overlooked, that her quiet support was part of the foundation beneath her husband's long hours. She smiled faintly, unsure what to say. "Well, I do what I can, though sometimes it feels like work takes most of him." Richard's eyes softened at her words, though he didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her face with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness, as though weighing what to say next. Emma looked down at her menu, her hands steadying themselves on the smooth paper. It was only the beginning of lunch, yet already she sensed this meal wouldn't be ordinary. She had expected polite conversation, maybe stories about the office. Instead, she felt as if Richard was pulling back a curtain she hadn't realized was there, showing her that someone else saw the life she lived in the background. And as the waiter arrived to take their orders, Emma's heart whispered a question she didn't dare speak aloud. What exactly did Richard want to say to her? The waiter disappeared with their menus, leaving Emma and Richard seated across from each other. For a moment, Emma wondered if she had made a mistake. This was her husband's boss, a man she barely knew, and here she was at a quiet table in the hotel restaurant. Yet the gentle piano notes and Richard's steady presence calmed her nerves more than she expected. Richard folded his hands on the table, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I hope Daniel's meeting won't keep him too long," he said, glancing toward the elevators. "He always tries to take on more than he should." Emma gave a small smile. "That sounds like him. He doesn't know how to stop." Richard chuckled softly. "It's one of his best qualities, and also one of his biggest weaknesses. I often worry he forgets where work ends and life begins." The comment lingered in Emma's mind. It was the same thought she carried silently at home, the long nights, the unanswered phone calls, the empty seat at the dinner table. To hear Richard say it out loud startled her. She wasn't sure if he meant it as casual conversation or if he understood more than he let on. She reached for her water glass, hoping to cover the sudden rush of emotion. "I suppose it's part of the job," she said. "It's what keeps the company moving forward." Richard's eyes rested on her, calm and searching. "Yes, but it's also what keeps people at home waiting." Emma froze. The words were too close to the truth. She felt exposed, as though he had read her thoughts. The waiter returned with a basket of bread, breaking the tension for a moment. Emma busied herself with a napkin, trying to compose her face. When the waiter left, Richard leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though the room around them had faded. "Emma," he said gently, "forgive me if I'm too direct, but do you ever feel unseen in all of this? The hours, the late nights, the business trips. Does anyone ever stop to ask how you feel about it?" The question landed like a stone in her chest. She stared at him, caught between the instinct to brush it off and the longing to answer truthfully. No one had ever asked her that. Not her friends, not her family, not even Daniel. People only saw her as the supportive wife, the one who smiled and said she understood. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around her glass. "I don't think about it much," she said. Though even to her own ears, the words sounded thin. Richard didn't look convinced. He leaned back in his chair, giving her space, but his eyes stayed steady. I don't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position. I see what dedication takes from people. Not just from the ones who work for me, but from the people waiting at home. And sometimes I wonder if anyone notices the quiet sacrifices. Emma felt her throat tighten. It wasn't that his words were flirtatious, they weren't. They were simply honest, maybe too honest. She had expected small talk, business chatter, maybe polite compliments. Instead, Richard had stepped right into the part of her heart she kept hidden. She tried to lighten the moment with a smile. You sound less like a boss and more like a counselor. Richard chuckled, though his gaze didn't waver. Maybe. Or maybe I've just learned to look past numbers and see the people behind them. Emma looked away, out the window where raindrops slid slowly down the glass. She didn't know why she felt suddenly vulnerable. As if speaking to him meant letting down walls she didn't even realize she had built. The food arrived, plates set before them with quiet precision. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh herbs filled the air, but Emma barely noticed. Her appetite had vanished, replaced with a swirl of emotions she couldn't name. Richard picked up his fork, then paused, watching her carefully. You don't have to answer me, he said softly. I just wanted to give you the chance. Sometimes people carry too much silence. Emma forced a smile, trying to regain control. I appreciate your concern, really. But I'm fine. Yet, as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. Fine wasn't the right word. Fine was the mask she wore every time Daniel's work came first. Fine was what she told herself when she ate alone. Fine was the way she explained away the ache of being left in the background. Richard didn't press her, and in that quiet restraint she felt something shift. It wasn't attraction, not yet, but it was attention, genuine attention. For the first time in a long while. Someone was asking about her, not just Daniel. Not just the life around him, the silence stretched, broken only by the clink of cutlery from other tables and the steady music from the piano. Emma focused on her plate, but her mind ran ahead. Should she trust him with her thoughts? Should she admit how lonely she sometimes felt? Or would that be a betrayal to Daniel, who worked so hard for their future? She caught Richard watching her, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't push, but the questions still lingered between them like an unopened letter. Emma set her fork down slowly, her hands folding in her lap. Her pulse quickened. She could keep pretending, keep the conversation light, and say she could speak honestly. Even if only once. Her lips parted, but the words stuck. She looked at Richard, saw the patience in his face, and felt her heart tremble. At last she whispered, almost to herself, sometimes it feels like I'm not really there. Like the work takes all of him and I'm left in the shadows. Richard didn't react with surprise or pity. Instead, his eyes softened and he gave a slow nod, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. The honesty of that moment left Emma's chest tight, her breath unsteady. She wasn't sure what she had just opened, but she knew the conversation had shifted, and as she lifted her gaze to meet his, she wondered what else would Richard reveal if she let the conversation continue. Emma's words hung in the air between them like fragile glass. She hadn't planned to say it out loud, not to him, not to anyone. Yet once spoken, there was no way to take them back. Her heart raced, and she wished she could hide behind her water glass. But she forced herself to meet Richard's gaze. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look judgmental. Instead, his face softened in a way she hadn't expected. He nodded slowly, almost as though he had been waiting to hear those words. You're not wrong to feel that way, Richard said quietly. His voice carried a weight that felt different from casual conversation. And you're not the only one who's ever felt unseen. Emma blinked, surprised. You, Richard gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes, success looks shiny from the outside. But it has a cost. My marriage ended years ago because I spent too much time in offices like this one, convincing myself that ambition could replace intimacy. I learned too late that people can't live on promises of tomorrow. His confession caught Emma off guard. She had expected him to brush off her words or politely change the subject. Instead, he had met her honesty with his own. She felt her chest tighten. Not with attraction exactly, but with recognition. This was a man who understood not from observation, but from experience. For a moment, silence wrapped around them. The restaurant noise seemed to fade, the music from the piano softening into background hum. Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice low. So you know what it feels like? To wait. To hope someone sees you, but they never do. Richard's eyes darkened, but his tone stayed steady. Yes, that's why I notice now. I see you, Emma. Not as Daniel's wife, not as a quiet figure waiting in a hotel lobby, but as yourself. Strong, graceful, caring more than anyone gives you credit for. Emma's breath caught. His words weren't wrapped in charm or flattery. They were deliberate, slow, and too precise to be careless. She wasn't used to being spoken to this way. At home, Daniel loved her, yes, but his love often came second to his deadlines. Richard's words, however, felt like a light turned directly on her, exposing everything she thought was hidden. Her fork lay untouched on the plate. The roasted chicken sat cooling, forgotten. She tried to steady her voice. Why are you telling me this? Richard leaned back, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed. Because honesty is rare, and I've spent too many years avoiding it. And because you deserve to hear it, even if no one else says it. You matter, Emma, more than you know. Her heart pounded harder now, every beat loud in her ears. She pressed her hands together in her lap, torn between gratitude and confusion. Was he simply being kind? Or was there something else in his words, something he wasn't saying directly? She searched his face, trying to read the intent behind his calm gaze. His eyes didn't wander, didn't carry the quick hunger of careless attraction. Instead, they held steady, as if he was fighting with himself to keep his emotions controlled. Emma looked away, staring at the rain-tracing patterns down the window. She wanted to believe this was nothing more than an unusual conversation. A rare moment of honesty shared between two people who understood loneliness. But part of her knew it wasn't that simple. The silence stretched too long. Finally, she asked softly, Do you always speak this openly to your employees' families? Richard gave a low laugh, shaking his head. No, never. If I'm honest, I've never spoken like this to anyone in years. But when I saw you sitting there, waiting alone, I couldn't stop myself from asking what no one else seems to ask. Emma's pulse quickened again, and she felt her cheeks grow warm. There was no mistaking it. Now his words weren't only professional concern. There was something personal threaded between every syllable, and yet, despite the weight of it, she didn't feel threatened. Instead, she felt seen in a way that made her chest ache. She whispered, almost afraid of the answer, "And what do you see, Richard?" For a moment, he said nothing. He looked down at his hands, as if steadying himself, then raised his gaze back to hers. His voice was firm, steady, but low enough that only she could hear. I see a woman who gives her heart to someone who doesn't always realize the gift he has. I see someone who deserves laughter at the dinner table, not silence. Someone who deserves to be cherished, not left waiting. And I see someone who, if I'm not careful, I'll admire more than I should. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The last line had changed everything. Until then, she could have believed this was empathy, maybe kindness. But now there was no denying the edge of confession in his voice. Her heart thudded violently, torn between shock and an unspoken, dangerous curiosity. She wanted to look away, but her eyes stayed locked on his. Caught by the raw honesty he had just given her, the sound of a waiter passing by jolted her back to the present. She reached for her glass, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it. She took a sip of water, though her throat was too tight for it to ease. Her mind raced. She should stand up, end this lunch, before it crossed any further lines. She should remind him and herself that she was Daniel's wife. But the truth she couldn't escape was this. Part of her wanted to hear more. Emma set the glass down carefully, trying to steady her voice. That's a very dangerous thing to say. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable, though his eyes carried something she couldn't name. I know, and yet I meant every word. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Emma's pulse quickened, her chest tight with emotions she had buried for too long. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her as if she was more than a quiet figure in the background. And though she knew she should resist it, she couldn't deny the truth. Richard's honesty had stirred something inside her she wasn't ready to face. Emma sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Richard's words still echoed in her mind. If I'm not careful, I'll admire you more than I should. It was the kind of honesty that left no room for misunderstanding. He hadn't been careless. He had chosen each word deliberately. And now Emma felt the weight of that choice pressing down on her chest. The restaurant's soft music floated around them, but Emma barely heard it. Her thoughts spun, clashing against one another. She should be angry. She should stand and leave. She should protect Daniel, her marriage, her life. Yet beneath those instincts, another voice whispered, dangerous. Quiet voice that asked what it would feel like to be truly seen, truly cherished, even for a moment. Richard sat across from her, calm but clearly fighting his own storm. His fork lay untouched, his posture tense. He had crossed a line and he knew it. Yet he didn't backtrack or apologize. He simply looked at her, steady and unflinching, as if daring her to decide what this moment would mean. Emma finally spoke, her voice soft but trembling. You shouldn't have said that. Richard leaned back, his jaw tightening, but he didn't argue. I know. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. Her throat tightened. Do you realize what you're doing? What this could mean for Daniel, for us? I do, he said firmly. And that's why I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to betray him. I respect your marriage. I respect Daniel. But Emma, I also respect you too much to stay silent. You deserve to hear the truth, that you are remarkable, that you matter, and that someone sees you in ways you may not even see yourself. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. His words weren't a confession of desire alone. They were recognition, affirmation, something she had longed to hear but never expected. For years she had accepted invisibility as the cost of Daniel's ambition. And here was Richard, tearing through that silence with a few simple sentences. She took a shaky breath, pressing her napkin between her fingers. And what do you expect me to do with that truth? Richard's gaze softened. Nothing. Not today. Not ever unless you choose to. I only needed you to know it. To know that you're not invisible. The simplicity of it left Emma stunned. He wasn't pushing her. He wasn't asking her to choose between loyalty and temptation. He was simply placing the truth in front of her, leaving it in her hands. Her heart ached with conflicting emotions. Gratitude, fear, a flicker of longing she didn't dare name. She looked down at her untouched plate, the food growing cold, and whispered, Richard, this can't happen. Whatever this is, it can't go further. I know, he replied quietly, but it already happened in words, if not in anything else. And maybe words are enough. Emma lifted her eyes to his, searching. What she saw there wasn't reckless desire. It was restraint, held tightly like a rope about to snap. It was admiration, but it was also control. He was telling her the truth, but he wasn't demanding anything from her. That, somehow, made it harder. She rose slowly from her chair, her hands trembling as she set her napkin on the table. Richard stood too, as if instinctively, his expression unreadable. For a long moment they faced each other, the air thick with everything unsaid. Emma managed a small, wavering smile. Thank you for your honesty. But some lines, once crossed, can't be undone. I can't let that happen. Richard inclined his head, his voice low but steady. I understand. But even if we never speak of this again, remember what I said? You are more than the shadow of someone else's ambition. Don't forget that. Her throat tightened painfully. She turned toward the restaurant doors before her emotions betrayed her. Each step away from the table felt heavier than the last. She didn't dare look back, though every part of her wanted to, as she walked through the lobby. The sound of the rain outside had softened, but her heart thundered louder than ever. Daniel would finish his meeting soon. He would find her waiting just as she always did. She would smile, they would drive home. And life would continue as if nothing had happened. Yet Emma knew something had shifted inside her forever. She had been reminded that she wasn't invisible, that her presence had weight, that her quiet sacrifices weren't unseen. She didn't know what she would do with that knowledge, but she knew she couldn't bury it again in the elevator lobby. Emma paused, her reflection in the polished marble wall staring back at her. She looked the same navy dress, same careful smile. But she felt different. And for once, she wasn't ashamed of that difference. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, but she didn't turn around. She knew if she did, she might see Richard, and the look in his eyes would be too much to carry. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked toward the waiting area where Daniel would eventually emerge. Minutes later, Daniel appeared, his suit slightly wrinkled, his phone buzzing in his hand. He smiled when he saw her, apologetic but distracted. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Em. You know how these meetings go?" Emma returned his smile, her heart twisting. "I know." He reached for her hand and she let him take it, though her thoughts still echoed with Richard's voice. "You are not invisible." As they walked out of the hotel together, Emma felt the pull of two worlds: the life she had built with Daniel, steady but demanding, and the fleeting moment of honesty Richard had offered her. Dangerous but deeply human. She chose silence. For now. But she carried Richard's words with her like a secret flame, one that would burn quietly in the corners of her heart. And though the day went on and life returned to its familiar rhythm, Emma knew she would never forget the lunch that had changed everything, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did.